Hi everybody, and welcome to Module 9 of Biodiversity and Sustainability. This is the module all about the generation of new species. So in some of the previous lectures, we've talked about what determines the number of species in an area or on an island, and we talked about things like the processes of immigration, speciation, extinction, and emigration. Now we're going to dive into one of those processes and look at some of the ways that new species can occur. Okay, so I'm just going to start sharing the screen. Okay, let's get started. So by the end of this class, you guys should be able to describe some of the fundamental patterns in evolution and compare some of the patterns that can lead to the arrival of new species. So we finished on these two slides last time. So we talked about what do mass extinctions do to diversity. So we showed in the mass extinctions lecture, there have been these 5 mass extinction events that have taken place. And so we started to think about, okay, well, let's draw our prediction of how diversity changes with mass extinctions. But when you actually look at the sort of extant number of families, you see that even though we've had these periods of mass extinction, and we do get some little dips, see, this is the dip after the Ordovician mass extinction, the Permian, the Cretaceous. Generally, the diversity seems to have continuously increased. Now, it's important to remember there is what we call a smoothing function applied to this figure in order to reduce noise. So they smooth it over a few years. So on these mass extinction, you would see a big instantaneous blip, but it recovers so quickly that the smoothing function is covering it up. So we have this situation where even though we've had these mass extinctions, which lead to over 75% of the species that were alive at the time going extinct, despite that, if we look at the number of families, it's just continued to increase all the time. So something very interesting is going on here. So the question is, well, why do mass extinctions not massively reduce diversity in the longer term? We would expect if we've got an awful lot of things going extinct. Remember, in some places, we're losing entire classes of species. We're losing huge taxonomic groups. But over time, the number of families of species is continuously increasing. So what's going on? Well, we have to start with a thing called the niche concept. So the niche concept is this idea that every single species has its ecological niche. So what we say is that species have a set of what we call requirements for life, which we can term its ecological niche. So here, for example, we've got this pretty little dove. And this dove, and on the figure below, represents 2 components of this species' ecological niche. So on the x-axis, we have grain size going from very small to big. On the y-axis, we have dryness going from very dry to very humid. And what we see is the green area represents the points at which this dove can exist. So the dove can exist in areas that have grain size not smaller than this and not bigger than this. So this is the range of grain that this particular dove can consume. When we look at humidity, it can't cope with something incredibly humid, and it can't cope with something incredibly dry. It's got this nice sweet spot or Goldilocks zone in the middle. So in the space where these 2 things occur, in areas where we have grain size that's this big and dryness values between here and here, this dove can survive. So this is 2 components of its ecological niche. The niche for this species on these 2 axes is grain size of that big, dryness of that big. Okay. If it gets too humid, dove can't survive. If there's not big enough grain size, dove can't survive. And if the grain size is all too big, the dove can't survive. Basically, it has these requirements for life, a set of parameters that its environment must contain in order for it to survive. We might then add on another species. So here's another species of dove, and we put it on the same axes. This dove, it's slightly different. It can live off very, very small grain sizes, but its maximum grain size it consumes isn't as big as the first dove. It's back here. But it has a much wider area of habitation on the dryness scale. So this one, we can see this represents this dove's niche space. First of all, when we look at these 2, what do we immediately see? Well, the red niche space for this dove, the area it contains is much bigger than this one. So that means this dove can survive in a broader range of ecosystems. Also, these two areas aren't completely overlapping. So there are some areas where one dove can survive and some areas where they can't. There is, however, this set of, if we put them on top of each other, this space here, this is, both doves are capable of surviving under this set of conditions. So in this set of conditions where it's just the red, only this dove can survive. When it's only the green, only this dove can survive. Where they overlap, in this set of conditions, both doves can survive, and more than likely they will compete with each other. So each species has its own ecological niche. It has a niche that where it can survive on a certain, and in this case we just got it on two particular axes, but it's the real one is multi-axes. Okay. So now let's do the same thing with some plants. So let's say, okay, here we have a cactus. Cactus, we know, or cacti, have got a very high temperature tolerance and they've got a very high dryness tolerance. You compare that to something like heather from Scotland. There's not a lot of deserts in Scotland and it's certainly not that hot. So its temperature tolerance is much lower and its dryness tolerance is much lower. Now, as I said, in these examples, we're describing the niche based on just two factors because it's easy to graph. But for each species, the niche is described by many, many, many factors, not just two. So for plants, its niche will include, let's take these two to start with, temperature tolerance, dryness, but it will also include soil chemistry, air chemistry, altitude, presence of pollinators, presence of different herbivores, a whole bunch of different components for a species niche. We're just focusing on these two, well, because it's easy to graph. It's very difficult to graph things. It's where you can graph things in 3D, it is possible. In 4D, it just becomes, it's not really possible at all. So what we have the situation is every species has its own particular niche. So after a mass extinction, species are destroyed, but the ecological roles or the niches remain. So after a mass extinction, many ecological roles are empty. So the species that survive these mass extinctions rapidly evolve to fill these vacancies. So after you've had a mass extinction, although the species itself is dead, the functions and the things that that species did in the ecosystem, there still is a need for that. And so what happens is any species that survive sometimes rapidly evolve and change and fill these vacancies. One of the most dramatic examples of this is the rise of the mammals. The rise of the mammals is a great example of what happens after a mass extinction when these ecological roles are empty. So if you remember back to the last mass extinctions, the first sort of shrew-like mammal, so a shrew is a little insectivorous beastie about sort of this big. The first mammals all looked like that. They were all insect eaters and they were little tiny shrew, about the size of a mouse sort of things, but they ate insects. So the first shrew-like mammal evolved and arrived on Earth about 160 million years ago. If you look in the fossil record, this thing was quite happily surviving with the dinosaurs. Bearing in mind, dinosaurs didn't go extinct for until 65 million years ago. So this thing basically coexisted with dinosaurs for about 100 million years. But 65 million years ago, the asteroid hits the planet and it killed off the dinosaurs. And this extinction of the dinosaur extinction led to many empty niches. But even though it killed off the dinosaurs, our little mammal survives. And what happens to our little mammal? Well, the dinosaur extinction led to many empty niches. And after 100 million years of these little shrews being small and inconspicuous, the mammals rapidly evolve to fill the niches left by the dinosaurs. So for example, we have, so bearing in mind, this little thing, this is the origin of all mammals, and it was going for 100 million years in this state. So dinosaurs go extinct after 65 million years, 34 million years ago, so within 30 million years of dinosaurs going extinct, these gigantic land mammals appear. So 35 to 23 million years ago, this thing walked the earth. It weighed up to 20 tons. It was the size of 5 elephants. It was an absolute monster. There's not been a land mammal since it. It's called the Indricothea, and it was absolutely huge. In addition, we had the Calicothea. This arrived only less than 20 million years after the dinosaurs went extinct and survived up until 1 million years ago. Because what happened was the asteroid had taken out the dinosaurs. And so remember, when the dinosaurs went extinct, pretty much every single land animal bigger than a dog went extinct. However, the things that those land animals were eating, big plants, trees, grass, and things like that, those plants were still around. And so there was a vacancy for a large land animal that could graze on all of these different plant types. As a result, the little shrew, the little insect-eating shrew, rapidly evolved into a whole series of large plant-eating animals. Remember, these were really big. These are bigger than elephants, and they came from something about that big. In addition, we started to get large terrestrial carnivores that evolved to prey on these herbivores. So remember, dinosaurs went extinct 65 million years ago. In the fossil record, about 60 million years ago, we see this early creodont appear. So this early creodont is a very early mammalian carnivore. You can see by the teeth that is clearly a carnivore. So within 5 million years, our little tiny shrew had evolved into a large terrestrial carnivore. In addition, we started seeing other parts of the world, the hyenodon appear. 40 to 20 million years ago, this thing was walking the earth. So we've got this little tiny shrew evolving into both big herbivores and also evolving into big carnivores that then prey on these herbivores. What was really interesting was the mammals even returned to the sea. Remember, during the age of the dinosaurs, there were things like mosasaurs and plesiosaurs swimming around in the ocean, these big, large predators swimming around in the ocean and eating all sorts. They were all driven to extinction at the end of the dinosaurs. So that meant there was a vacancy for a large air-breathing predator in the oceans. The reason that being an air breather in the ocean is actually advantageous is because the physiology of breathing air means you can process oxygen much, much faster than if you're breathing water. Air is much lighter, it's much easier to move, and the amount of oxygen air contains is much greater than the amount of oxygen water contains. What that means is, if you are an animal that breathes air and you go into the water, you have a huge physiological advantage in terms of pursuit over a water-breathing species. This is why dolphins, whales, seals, these things do very, very well at catching fish because their aerobic capacity, their ability to essentially move at speed for a long distance is much higher than a fish. So as there was an opening. And what happened was this little mammal, our little shrew, evolved into a series of species that moved back to the sea. So that the Rhodocetus is a great example of this. It appeared about 46 million years ago. So again, less than 20 million years after the dinosaurs had gone extinct, our little shrew had evolved into a whale ancestor. And we'll talk about these at the end because they're a really interesting story. And over time, well, not a very large amount of time at all, mammals actually become the dominant group in the fossil record. So this is our phylogeny. Apologies for the size of this image. There are an awful lot of mammals. If you want to see the original figure this paper came from, it's in the week 5 Canvas folder. It's in the same, and it's also in the module 9 folder on Canvas. So this is all the mammals here. We can see we've got elephants, aardvarks, looks like possums, monkeys, bush babies, capybaras, the whales, zebra, bats, all sorts of things. Everybody's in there. And this is where we go millions of years ago. So this is the current present day. And we're going back and we see, the mammals first arrived. So true mammals first arrived somewhere around here, about 160 million years ago. And then we can see that for an awful long time, the mammals were just split between the placentals and the marsupials and ticked along, ticked along, ticked along, ticked along. And about here is where the dinosaurs go extinct. So you can see, here's the point where the dinosaurs have gone extinct. Suddenly, these mammals branch off into lots and lots and lots of different forms. And the reason they're branching off like this is they're filling up all those vacancies, all those niches that were left by the dinosaurs going extinct. Mammals rapidly evolved into lots of different things to fill all the gaps. Okay. So, just to make sure everyone's up to speed, we'll do a fake clicker question. What of these options best describes the stories of the mammals? So A, the first mammals lived alongside the dinosaurs. They remained small and unchanged until the dinosaurs died out. B, the first mammals appeared after the dinosaurs. C, the mammals evolved from dinosaurs that survived the mass extinction. D, mammals evolved from birds. Just give you 10 seconds on that one. Okay, let's see. Well, correct answer to this one is A. So yeah, the first mammals lived alongside the dinosaurs. Remember, they were these little tiny shrews. They remained small and unchanged until the time at which the dinosaurs died out. And this rapid evolution to fill a whole bunch of different niches is called adaptive radiation. It's you start off with one particular species or one group of species. It finds itself in a new location, or something happens to its present location, which means suddenly there's lots of opportunities for it, and it radiates out into loads and loads of different species. And we call that adaptive radiation. So here's the sort of how it looks in the mammals. So we started off with our insectivore stock, our little tiny shrew. The moment the dinosaurs were lost, it radiated out into all these different types. Okay, so what this means is we start off with one species and it radiates out to loads. Okay, now this adaptive radiation of the mammals following the extinction of the dinosaurs is a fantastic example from the fossil record, and we can track it all the way through by looking at fossils of different ages. And it's great because it's also global, and it shows this example of there was this huge global extinction, and all over the planet we saw this adaptive radiation of one group of animals radiating out and becoming loads. But many smaller examples exist. It's not just this big, huge global event. We've got lots of small examples which you can see all over the planet. And one of the times it's really common that this sort of thing turns up is when species arrive on a new island. Now, islands are interesting because generally they're little miniature reruns of evolution. So if you look at what's happened all over the planet, an island often is a miniaturized version of that because a new species comes in and it has this same principle. A new species arrives on an island. All these vacancies, all these ecological niches are vacant on the island. So the first species comes in and it radiates out to fill all of them. And so we have this situation where in some cases we see adaptive radiation and species filling roles that are filled by other species in other parts of the world. So for example, one of the most dramatic is the adaptive radiation in Darwin's finches. This was the process, the story, and the system that inspired Darwin to write about the theory of evolution in the first place. So we talked about the Galapagos Islands being 600 miles off the coast of Ecuador. So on Ecuador, there is this reasonably common little finch species called blue-black grassquit. It's quite common on this whole area. It's basically a regular nondescript finch. It's present all over Ecuador. And it's believed that this finch, at some point during the development of the Galapagos Islands, members of this finch species crossed the ocean, probably in a storm. This is a bit hurricane-y, they weren't on their own steam. Crossed the ocean and arrived in the Galapagos Islands. When that finch arrived on the Galapagos Islands, it was one of the first birds to arrive, and it saw that there was this whole area, a whole suite of empty niches. So what we see the adaptive radiation in Darwin's finches. So the original bird is this ancestral seed-eating ground finch. So the blue-black grassquit is just a regular bird, eats seeds, and it predominantly sort of forages on the ground. But if you look at the evolution of the birds following, you can do this through morphology, you can do it through DNA. This one little bird appears to have evolved into a whole suite of different species. It's evolved into these groups that all eat mainly insects, including the medium tree finch, the large tree finch, the mangrove finch, the woodpecker finch, the warbler finch, the Cocos Islands finch. So it's no longer eating seeds, it's now eating insects. Some of these still mainly eat seeds, including the large ground finch, the medium ground finch. Some of them, the most astonishing is those that go for cactus seeds and parts. We've also got one species that goes exclusively on buds and fruits, doesn't go for seeds or insects. And they've all evolved, they've radiated out from this one ancestral seed-eating groundfinch. Because when Darwin first visited the Galapagos Islands, he noticed, yes, there were all these different finches, and they were all eating different diets. But if you looked at them, you could still see common characteristics across all these species. They still, the closely related ones obviously look very similar, but even ones that were eating entirely different diets, so they're mainly seeds versus mainly insects, you could still see the morphology of the head and the bill was still reasonably similar amongst these birds that were now eating totally different diets. And it's because they all shared a common ancestor. And then an initial species arrived on the island and then radiated out and produced a whole suite of different species. Okay, so that was the adaptive radiation in Darwin's finches is one of the classic examples of adaptive radiation. It's one of the classic examples of how a single species can rapidly evolve to fill a whole bunch of different niches and become different species, but it's actually not the most dramatic. The most dramatic example is the group that we talked about previously, the adaptive radiation in Lake Malawi cichlids. And the really nice thing about Lake Malawi cichlids is because there's so many more of them, more species, there's a lot more data to work with. So the story of the Lake Malawi cichlids is it's estimated based on genetics that about 2.7 to 6.5 million years ago, a single species of cichlid moved from the Great Ruhr River into Lake Malawi. So there's a whole suite of rivers around here, and it arrived in Lake Malawi. When it first got there, that first cichlid species, it found a lake entirely free of fish. That cichlid was the first fish species to exist in Lake Malawi. When it got there, now normally if we think of these big lakes, they're full of multiple species of fish that do all sorts of stuff. But in this case, it was just the first one. But when this fish arrived, it rapidly diversified through adaptive radiation to become many species with a huge variety of niches. So now in the lake today, there are predators, there are herbivores, there are scale-eating specialist cichlids that have their mouth kinked to one side or the other, and they literally bite the scales off other fish. There's also bottom feeders and everything. Now, in the modern day, there's about 850 species of Lake Malawi cichlid, all of which evolved from a single common ancestor due to adaptive radiation. If you look at the actual genetics of them, this is I have to admit, a very complicated figure, but what it shows is this is the original species in this sector here, in this branch, and then it's rapidly evolved out into all of these different cichlid species. There is some larger branches, but it's lots and lots of new species produced. Okay, and although they look very different, you can still see they share some similar morphological characteristics. Although they're very different colors, in some cases different shapes, the head style, the way the eye is positioned, the shape of the dorsal fin with this characteristic bit on the end that you don't see in many other species apart from cichlids, all sort of, although they're very, very different, they still share these clear morphological characteristics. And running genetics on them, you can actually trace out the adaptive radiation. It's a really cool study system. So all this talk of new species begs a question. And that question is, well, just what is a species? Have a think about this. we've talked an awful lot about, oh, well, it's this species of plant, it's this species of fish, or this species of bird, and all these species were generated from a single common ancestor based on adaptive radiation and yada, yada, yada. But what is a species? Just have a think about it. So the basic definition, and the one that's held to be most adopted, is a species is a group of organisms that can breed with each other, and the offspring that are produced can also breed. Okay, so in order to be a species, in order for two things to be members of the same species, they can breed, and the offspring they produce is then also capable of breeding. So things like, the critical part is that to be a species, the offspring must be fertile. So here we have a horse, and here we have a donkey. Are horses and donkeys the same species? Well, you can actually breed a horse with a donkey. You can make that happen. And what it produces is a mule. And mules are really useful because they are pretty big, they're good, useful draft animals, and they've got really high stamina and they're really strong. So a horse and a donkey can be bred together and you end up with a mule. So are horses and donkeys the same species or a different species? Well, technically, they're different species because even though they can breed, mules are what we call infertile hybrids. They cannot breed. You can't take two mules and make them breed with each other and get a new baby mule. It does not work. Instead, if you want a mule, you have to mate a horse with a donkey. So in order for something to be considered, so as a result, horses and donkeys are not the same species because although they can produce offspring, these offspring themselves cannot breed. Okay? And this process of what we call an infertile hybrid is observed amongst multiple species. You can actually breed a lion and a tiger together and you get what's called a liger. However, they are, again, infertile hybrids. They cannot breed themselves. So that's one. So we talked about a species, we talked about what a species is, and we talked about adaptive radiation. But let's have a look at some other ways in which new species can arrive. So another method through which a new species can arrive is something called reproductive isolation. So if we have a population, and if members of those species are separated from each other, those separated populations continue to evolve and can eventually become a new species. So one of the great examples of this from really near here is the Harris antelope squirrel and the white-tailed antelope squirrel. So both of these little ground squirrels, as well as being unbelievably cute, look very similar to each other. For a long time, they were actually thought to be the same species. However, what's happened with these two is they live on either side of the Grand Canyon. So on one side of the Grand Canyon, you get nothing but Harris antelope squirrels. The other side of the Grand Canyon, you get white-tailed antelope squirrels. Because what's happened is these squirrels are unable to cross the Grand Canyon. So as the Grand Canyon formed, the range of this species used to span the Grand Canyon. But as the Grand Canyon formed, it isolated the two species, one on one side and one on the other. Because they could no longer cross, they became reproductively isolated. They couldn't send genetic information. They couldn't breed backwards and forwards. Over time, the two populations continued to evolve, and now they've become new species. If you take a Harris antelope squirrel and a white-tailed antelope squirrel, they can no longer reproduce. They are now different species. So separating a species, separating a population of a single species into two populations and not allowing reproduction to occur between the populations, over time, you will end up with two species instead of one. And this is seen time and again. Harris antelope squirrel and the white-tailed antelope squirrel is a wonderful example, but it's also seen in the porkfish. So this is North America, here's South America, and here we have Central America. We talked a little while ago about how South America used to be an island and then it became connected to North America by this giant land bridge as the Caribbean plate moved into position. So when this happened, there was ancestrally a group of fish, or a species of fish that was around here called the porkfish. Nowadays, because the Isthmus of Panama separated the species into two populations, they've evolved and now become two different species that look very similar, but we have the porkfish that we see in the Caribbean, and we have the Panamic porkfish that we see in the Pacific, and they're separated by Central America. So what this means is, although they look very, very similar to each other, they can no longer breed. They became reproductively isolated when Central America split the population in two. But when we talk about reproductive isolation does not necessarily need to be geographical. It doesn't need to be the case where a population has become split in two because something about the land or the sea has changed and the individuals can no longer interact. It can also be behavioral. So a great example of this is seen here. So these two fruit fly species look almost identical. So you have Drosophila melanogaster. This is one of the most important species in the world in terms of genetic research. Most of what we know about genetics has been done on Drosophila melanogaster. But there's another species of fruit fly that looks very similar called Drosophila simulans. This one. They look almost identical. You have to be highly trained in order to tell these apart. However, fruit flies have highly complex mating behaviors. There's dances involved, there's positions, all sorts of stuff. So two populations of a common ancestor of these species became reproductively isolated and did not breed due to cultural differences in the mating behavior. Over time, the two populations have now bred only with each other and have now become different species. So they were never separated geographically. They were separated due to the complex mating behaviors that go on in the original species of fly. Okay. So we talked about this adaptive radiation species, and one thing that's often brought up when people are talking about adaptive radiation, speciation, general adaptation generally, and the proliferation of new species is, well, have we as people ever observed a new species appearing on the planet? Have we ever observed speciation occurring? And the answer to that is yes, and actually very, very nearby to here. One of the best examples of this is with this group of flowers called the goat's beards. So goat's beards historically only exist in Europe. They're a European group of flowers. They're very pretty, they're quite cute, and they grow very well in the sort of semi-arid landscape that we have in Utah and Idaho and Wyoming. So in the 1900s, 3 species of goat's beards were introduced to the USA. They were brought over from Europe because they were quite pretty and we wanted something nice to look at. And these 3 goat's beards are called the Western Salsify, the Meadow Salsify, and the Purple Salsify. All of them came from Europe. If you bred them with each other, if you took the pollen from one and introduced it to the flower of another, you could hybridize these 3 species, but the hybrids were always sterile. So you could hybridize them, but it produced sterile offspring. So remember, that is the definition that these were different species. Because although they could breed with each other, the offspring could not breed. So these things were brought to North America, they were brought to the West, and they very, very rapidly spread over the entire region. They grow very well in our climate, and they found themselves in a place where, as you have with a new species when it arrives on an island, there was this vacancy for a small flower that could grow in the sort of landscapes we have here. So they were introduced in the 1900s. In the 1950s, because bear in mind, these were introduced by horticulturalists. They were introduced as ornamental plants. There wasn't a lot of science going on, but in the 1950s, scientists noticed something very strange in these plants. So, in the US, we now had 2 new species of goat's beards. We had something called the Moscow salsify, which is native to Idaho. It was first identified in Moscow, Idaho. And we had this particular one, the remarkable goat's beard. This was remarkable because it's got the yellow interior, the strange purple flowers, and these extended leaf petals. And this is native now to the entire USA. No one, it spread so much, no one really identified where it came from. Now, what's interesting about these species, the Moscow salsify and the remarkable goat's beard, is they actually look like hybrids. They look a little bit like intermediates between the originals. So if you look at the remarkable, it has petals that look a bit like this, but they're purple. And it also has these bits, these leaves sticking out the side. So they look a bit like hybrids, but critically, they're fertile. So these species, individuals of these, you can breed them with each other and they produce new offspring, and those offspring they themselves can breed. But critically, both of these species can't reproduce with the original species that were introduced, and they can't breed with each other. So these new species, so a Moscow salsify can only breed with other Moscow salsifys. It can't breed with any of the original goat's beards that were introduced to the US. In addition, the remarkable goat's beard can only reproduce with other remarkable goat's beards. It can't reproduce with the originals that were brought across. This is the classic definition of a species. It is now a new species that can only reproduce with members of itself. Now, this particular story of the goat's beards does bring up quite an interesting conundrum, because these three plants, these three goat's beards originally introduced, they've sort of become invasive. They're problematic. They're excluding other plants. They're outcompeting native species in the US. And so you might sit there and go, well, we need to eradicate them. They're invasive species, get rid of them. But what do we do with these? Because although they are descended from an invasive species, they're technically native now to the US, because the only place you find them in the world is in the US. The only place you find this one is in Idaho. It is endemic to Idaho. So should we eradicate them as invasive species? Because aren't they now native species because they exist nowhere else in the world? It presents this kind of different, but they're still outcompeting ancestral native species. So it presents quite a difficult sort of ethical conundrums about what to do. But it's just one example of when we have observed, not quite in my lifetime, but certainly within a few human generations, we've observed speciation happening in the US within nearby. Okay. Now, when we talk about that, we might find other examples around the planet of species in the process of adaptive radiation splitting. One of the classics of these is the Arctic char. So I don't know if anyone's ever eaten Arctic char, caught Arctic char. You don't get them down here. You get them all. They're a salmonid, like a trout or a salmon that lives all across the Arctic. It's a very, very tasty fish, and it's an Arctic salmonid. Basically, it's like a trout, but from way, way, way north. Now, this species might be anadromous, like a salmon, i.e. it breeds in fresh water and then it swims out to the ocean to grow and it returns back up the rivers to breed, or it can be full freshwater like a trout. But what's really interesting about this species, it exists in 4 different body morphs. So these are all members of the same species. They're all adults, and they can even all live in the same bodies of water. So the morphs are the biggest morph that you'll see of Arctic char, the ones that people most like to catch, the ones that are most used for food, are the piscivorous morph. So this is the piscivorous. It's big and it eats almost exclusively fish. Then the next one in size is the large benthic. The large benthic predominantly lives on the bottom, and rather than eating other fish, it eats macroinvertebrates like little insects at the gravel and things like that. The next one on the next size down is the planktivorous morph. The planktivorous morph eats little tiny plankton floating around in the water, and the dwarf is an absolutely tiny compared to the others, and it eats a mixture of plankton, but also benthic macroinvertebrates on the bottom. So these are all the same species. They can breed with each other and produce fertile offspring, but they exist in these 4 very different body morphs. Now, In the wild, normally, Arctic char mate within a morph. So normally, male piscivorous morphs mate with female piscivorous morphs, male planktivorous mate with female planktivorous, and things like that. However, as per usual, it's the males that are the problem. So some males will sneak to mate with different morphs, especially the dwarfs and the planktivorous. So you'll often have the situation where if you have a very large male planktivorous morph and a very large female planktivorous morph, and they make a nest in the bottom of the gravel, as they're in the process of the male sending out his milt and the female sending out her eggs, as those are mixing in the water, you'll sometimes get a little tiny sneaky dwarf male will swim in to the middle of this and start releasing their own milt and end up fertilizing some of the eggs. And it's called sneaky mating. It's not actually called sneaky mating. It's called, the technical term scientifically is sneaky something else that is another word for mating that you're not allowed to say in lectures or you get shouted at. But they sneak in and they can reproduce and produce these hybrids. And what that, sorry, not hybrids, intermediates. And these fish that are produced, which we call intermediates, so they share characteristics of both, they tend not to survive as well as the specialized morphs. So these specialized fish, the purebred piscivorous, purebred large benthic, purebred planktivorous, and purebred dwarfs, survive very well. They've been going for a very long time. The intermediates that occur when a dwarf mates with a piscivorous don't survive nearly so well. They're not specialized on one diet or the other, and not specialized on one lifestyle or the other, and they just don't survive as well. And so what this means is that Arctic char might represent a transitional or intermediate form. Because the specialized morphs survive so much better than the ones that aren't specialized, the specialized morphs are at an advantage and they're becoming reproductively isolated and separating away. And what this means is that Arctic char may represent a single species in the process of splitting into 4 new species. They're on the path to reproductive isolation, but they've not got there just yet. As a result, Arctic char are an intermediate form between 4 potentially new species. And there are many, many examples of these traditional or intermediate forms in the fossil record. So an intermediate form is a species that shares characteristics, usually an extinct species that shares characteristics of multiple living species. So we've talked previously about Archaeopteryx is one of the classic intermediate forms because it shares the head and teeth and bony tail of a reptile, but it has the feathers of a bird. So it shares these very, very clear characteristics of 2 totally different groups of animals. In addition, there was Tiktaalik, which was one of the classic examples of a transitional form. So it was technically a fish, it's a type of lobed fin fish, but it was capable of crossing over on land. It was capable of walking on these lobed fins. And it shared, its head morphology was starting to look very amphibian-like. So it shares some characteristics of 2 different groups of species, fish and amphibians, and it was a transitional form as fish were evolving, a group of fish were evolving into amphibians. Okay, and we see loads of these. There's tons of them in nature. Now, in that case, we talk about Archaeopteryx and Tiktaalik represent, okay, one species as an intermediate form between many. But every species is technically an intermediate form between the ones that preceded it and the ones that came after. And whales may show the best series of intermediate and transitional forms. And whales are a great species study for a couple of reasons. Well, whales have received a lot of attention because, well, one, they are the largest species of animal ever. So the blue whale that is alive on the planet today exists in all the big oceans. That is the largest animal that has ever lived. It was much bigger, well, it's not much bigger, but it's bigger than the biggest dinosaurs. It is absolutely enormous. In addition, whales are really interesting because they come from an ancestral terrestrial mammal and they've moved from the land to the sea. So they're really charismatic, they're really big, and they've got a great story. They've gone through this enormous process of going from a fully terrestrial species to a fully marine species. So because they've done this big change and they're huge, it's kind of cool. So the life history of whale ancestors, so the way they behave in their habitat, actually makes them fossilize very well. Because in order for something, the best way for an animal to fossilize is the animal dies and ends up at the bottom of a riverbed. And because on the bottom of a riverbed, it's got sediment in the river continuously washing over it, that sediment buries it, preserves it, and it encourages the process of fossilization where the bones turn to rock. And whales live in wetlands, and historically they live in oceans, they live in rivers, they live in the perfect place to fossilize. If anything was ever going to fossilize, it was going to be a whale. Their life history and where they exist means that they've got lots of opportunities for fossilization. Because of this process, because they're very large species, they're easy to find, because they've moved from the land to the sea, they're going to do this big change, and because their life history makes them fossilize very well, most of the lineage, the evolutionary history of whales is known from very, very well-preserved, high-quality fossils. So let's go through them. So the earliest, for want of a better word, whale that exists is this species called Pakicetus. It's called Pakicetus because it was first found in Pakistan. The fossils of this seen about 48 million years ago. It is considered the earliest whale. But this species is not what we would think of as a modern whale in any way, shape, or form. It's clearly terrestrial. Like, this thing walks on land. This is not a good swimmer at all. It has toes and claws. And it's about the size of a dog. But its skull is very, very similar to modern killer whales and pilot whales. So this is a species that is about the size of your dog at home. It's clearly a terrestrial animal. It's got highly developed limbs, decent sized tail, pelvis. Clearly a terrestrial animal, about the size of a dog, but it shares a few characteristics with a modern whale. After Pakicetus, we get this next species called Myocetus. This is moved on from Pakicetus a bit. It still has proper forelimbs. The fossils of it still include some hair. It still has full hind limbs. Its skeleton still has a pelvis. But based on where this thing lived and the lifestyle it had a similar lifestyle to a sea lion. So it spends some time on land, or like an otter. It hunts in the water potentially, but it spends a lot of time on land. This thing was easily able to move around on land. After Myocetus, next up in the fossil record, we see this thing called Rhodocetus. This was the first truly marine whale ancestor. We've still got hind limbs. Whales don't have any hind limbs at all. Still got hind limbs, but now in the fossils, we see that they've got webbed feet. This thing has lost its fur. And critically, this region of the back, this region, let's get the laser pointer. This region at the back here, we've got the rising, this is the large muscles, anchor points for the large muscles this animal needs to undulate as it swims. Okay, so it's the first truly marine ancestor. This animal is more comfortable in the water than it is on the land. After Rhodocetus, we see Durodon. This one's first appears in the fossil record about 37 million years ago. At this point, this animal is basically, if you look at it, it's pretty unable to move on land. Its hind limbs have been reduced to these tiny, tiny little vestigial back legs. You can see them in the skeletons here. The pelvis is totally gone, got no pelvis anymore. So these little tiny limbs aren't actually attached to anything. The forelimbs are barely capable of reaching the ground, certainly not capable of propelling the animal along. But its forelimbs are now proper flippers. In addition, crucially, this is the first species in the whale lineage that has a tail fluke. So now the tail has got a full fin on the end of it. That means this is much quicker and much more efficient at moving in the water. After Durodon, we see Lianocetus. This appears about 34 million years ago, so after the previous one. This species, critically, we see the first evidence of baleen, so in the teeth. A lot of whales that we know now, blue whales, humpback whales, right whales, grey whales, they don't have teeth per se, they have baleen plates instead. They use this for filtering organisms like plankton out of the water. But Lanocetus was the first time we started to see bits of baleen in the skull, and it's got no exterior hind limbs at all. Although it still has the remains of the bones for its hind limbs, there's no actual external limb at all anymore. So what we see is we go all the way back from Pakicetus to the modern blue whale. I'm just going to move this out of the way. We start at Pakicetus. We go all the way up to the blue whale. We have this beautiful series of intermediate forms where every stage is intermediate between the one previous and the one after. So we can see these transitional stages as we move from a terrestrial animal about the size of a dog with 4 limbs that's running around, all the way to a fully marine, gigantic species. And you can see in the skull remains very similar. A killer whale skull would be far more similar than this, but you can still see the same bones, the same layout. Okay, it's a fabulous example of a whole series of intermediate forms transitioning from one to the next. And if you want to see this story like as close to in the flesh as you can, if you go to the Smithsonian Museum in DC, they have an exhibit where around you they have all the different skulls of the different transitional forms of whales. Because these things fossilize so well and they're such big animals, we've got incredibly detailed, precise fossilized skulls of all of them. So this one above me here is a Lanocetus skull, and you can even see the bits of the very early baleen plates inside it. So it's a great example of intermediate forms. Okay, so one thing I want you really take away from this, and also to get in your head generally about evolution, is that, and speciation, is that don't think of the process of linear. I showed you there the whole series of intermediate forms of going from the sort of Pakicetus up to blue whale, but that was just one line of evolution. The whole time that line was taking place, there were other species radiating out in different directions and things like that. So in textbooks, especially historical textbooks, when they talk about evolution, and often with the evolution of man, you would see these sorts of images of, okay, we start off something that looks a bit like a chimpanzee, and the chimpanzee eventually evolves into a person. No, not how it works. It does not follow a linear process. It's not guided. It's not going to an end point. What instead happens is a series of splits, and some of those splits survive and some of them don't. So if we look at humans, how humans sit in the primates, this is based on genetic correlation. So here we've got the present, and here's in the past 50 million years ago. And we've got chimpanzees, humans, gorillas, and orangutans. Here is our sort of, and each time we have a split. So we have the common ancestor of all the great apes. The first split occurred about 14 million years ago, and that split, one lineage led to the orangutan, the other lineage led to all the others. Then about sort of 7 million years ago, we get the next split. This split, one lineage led to the gorilla, the next lineage led to chimpanzees and humans. And finally, about 5 million years ago, we had the split of this common ancestor split, and it became the chimpanzees and the humans. Okay, so the nice thing to take away about this is you and I are more closely related to chimpanzees than chimpanzees are to gorillas. So we form the main group, this is the out group. So although we like to think of ourselves being different than the great apes and yada, 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 we're actually more closely related to chimps than chimps are to gorillas. So that's kind of cool. And if we look at humans generally, not just the human, like we start off from, so this was here, we've already gone through this split here. So this is about 5 million years ago, now about 4 million years ago. So here's our Deripithine ancestors. So things like Australopithecus, we have the great fossil of Lucy, who is the classic fossil of the Australopithecus. Lucy this species of hominid was not a chimpanzee. It was sort of split off already. But so we start off with the original Australopithecus, and then we can see in the human lineage, we have all these different splits. So Australopithecus afarensis split into Australopithecus africanus. Australopithecus africanus had a much bigger brain case than afarensis. Then we also split down into this point, and then we split again, and we've got Parathrops robustus and Parathrops boesii. These two species both will have coexisted with Australopithecus in Africa. And then this is the hominid line. So this is where our genus. And so this then splits. We have Homo habilis. That also has a split, and we get the split of Homo ergaster, and that splits into here's Homo neanderthalis, and here's us, Homo sapiens. And then here's the other hominid line, which gave us Homo forensis. You might have heard about this. These were the small hobbit-like species that existed in islands in Indonesia, and Homo erectus went extinct about 250,000 years ago. And on this, what's really interesting about this figure is the blue represents Africa and the red represents out of Africa. So most of the sort of previous human species were African, pretty much all, including us. We evolved in Africa originally and then radiated out. But so all of this took place in Africa, the same continent where you get chimpanzees and gorillas. But there was two groups that radiated out of Africa. So Homo forensis and Homo erectus are Asian. So these live predominantly in Asia. Homo neanderthalis very famously made it into, was north out of Africa and went into Europe. So you had the Neanderthals in Northern Europe and things like that. We were in Africa for the vast majority of our history and only really expanded out of Africa about 60,000, 70,000 years ago. So the little red bit we get on the end. And as soon as we did that, we pretty much murdered everything else. So this shows you that the evolution of humans from our sort of Australopithecus ancestors is not a continual straight line. It's a series of splits. And the only difference is we were the only species that survived. Okay, so you guys should now be able to describe some of the fundamental patterns in evolution and compare some of the patterns that can lead to the arrival of new species. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. Goodbye, I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you next time.